April 14th, 1865, Washington, D.C. It is Good Friday. A gentle spring evening descends upon a city breathing its first tentative sighs of peace. For 4 long brutal years, the American capital had lived under the perpetual shadow of war. It was a city of hospitals, of marching troops, of muddy streets, churned by the weight of cannons and supply wagons. It was a city that had heard the thunder of Confederate artillery from its very outskirts. But now, silence. 5 days prior, at a quiet courthouse in the Virginia hamlet of Appomattox, General Robert E. Lee had surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. The war, for all intents and purposes, was over. The rebellion was crushed. The Union, preserved. The city on this night is a sea of flickering gaslight and celebration. Flags, some tattered and worn, others crisp and new, hang from nearly every window. Bonfires had burned for days, illuminating the faces of jubilant crowds singing patriotic songs in the streets. There is a feeling of profound, bone-deep exhaustion mixed with an almost giddy relief. The fever had broken. Now the long work of healing could begin. Inside Ford's Theater on 10th Street, the air is thick with the scent of perfume, damp wool and gaslight. The 3-tiered auditorium, a jewel of crimson and gold, is packed with over 1,700 souls. They are here for a night of levity, to see the acclaimed British actress Laura Keane in the popular comedy, Our American Cousin. It is a frivolous, silly play, a perfect antidote to years of grim news and casualty lists. The audience is a cross-section of Washington society, officers in their crisp blue uniforms, politicians with their wives, merchants, clerks, and ordinary citizens, all seeking a moment of escape. They murmur and laugh, fanning themselves with their programs, their faces upturned toward the grandly decorated state box, draped in Treasury Guard flags and adorned with a portrait of George Washington. They are waiting for him. They are waiting for the man who saved the Union. President Abraham Lincoln and his wife Mary are late. They had a full day. A day that began, as most of his did, with the relentless press of official business. But this day was different. It held a lightness he had not felt in years. He had met with his cabinet, discussing the monumental, almost unthinkable task of reconstruction. He spoke not of punishment, but of reconciliation. He told them, according to the diary of Navy Secretary Gideon Welles, that he wanted no bloody work, no hangings or executions of Confederate leaders. He spoke of letting Jefferson Davis escape the country, remarking it would be best to let him slip out unmolars, as if shooing away a troublesome pest, rather than vanquishing a foe. Later, he took a carriage ride with Mary. It was a rare moment of quiet intimacy. She would later recall his mood as almost unnaturally cheerful. "I have never seen him so happy," she would write. He spoke of the future, of life after the presidency, of traveling, perhaps to Europe, or to California, of returning to Springfield to practice law again. "We have had a hard time of it since we came to Washington," he told her. "But the war is over, and with God's blessing we may hope for 4 years of peace and happiness, and then we will go back to Illinois and live there the rest of our lives." It was a simple, humble dream for the man who had carried the weight of a nation on his stooped shoulders. The decision to attend the theater was a last-minute one. General Ulysses S. Grant and his wife Julia had been scheduled to join them, a public display of the Union's 2 greatest heroes, the statesman and the soldier, celebrating the peace together. But Julia Grant, uncomfortable with Mary Lincoln's often erratic temperament, had begged off, inventing a pressing need to visit their children in New Jersey. The Lincolns, not wishing to disappoint the public, invited another couple, Major Henry Rathbone, a handsome young Army officer, and his fiancée Clara Harris, the daughter of a prominent New York senator. Around 8:30 p.m., the presidential carriage clatters to a halt in front of Ford's. As Lincoln, tall and gaunt in his black frock coat, steps into the theater, the orchestra strikes up "Hail to the Chief." The entire audience rises as one, a thunderous wave of applause and cheers washing over him. He offers a slight, weary smile and a nod, his deep-set eyes, so often filled with melancholy, reflecting the warm glow of the gaslights. He is guided to the state box, a specially prepared double box overlooking the stage from the right. A comfortable horsehair rocking chair has been brought in specifically for his use. He sinks into it, a giant of a man folding himself into the small space, and the play resumes. The audience settles. The illusion of a perfect, celebratory evening is complete. But in the shadows of this grand theater, another man moves with purpose. He is not a soldier. He is not a politician. He is an artist, a performer, a man whose entire life has been lived upon the stage. John Wilkes Booth, the handsome, charismatic, 26-year-old scion of America's most famous acting family, knows this theater as well as he knows his own lines. He has performed on this very stage. He knows its entrances, its exits, its hidden corridors and secret passages. He moves through the building not as an intruder, but as one who belongs to the ticket taker, the stagehands, the other actors. He is simply J. Wilkes, a familiar, even beloved figure. They greet him with smiles and nods. He is a star. No one questions his presence here tonight. No one sees the burning fanaticism behind his dark, mesmerizing eyes. No one knows that for months, he has been nursing a venomous hatred for the man in the state box, a man he views not as a savior, but as a tyrant, a despot who has destroyed his beloved South. No one knows that the surrender at Appomattox did not bring him relief, but rage. It transformed his elaborate, desperate plot to kidnap the president into something far darker, far more final. He has spent the day making his preparations with a chilling, theatrical precision. He has written a letter to the editor of the National Intelligencer, a final manifesto to be published after the deed is done, explaining his motives to the world. He has visited a stable to arrange for a getaway horse. He has met with his small, scattered band of co-conspirators, assigning them their own bloody tasks in a grand, horrific drama of his own design. Now he makes his way to Taltavul's Star Saloon, adjacent to the theater. He orders a glass of whiskey, a moment of liquid courage. He can hear the muffled sounds of the play through the wall, the dialogue, the laughter of the crowd. He knows the play by heart. He knows the precise moment, the precise line, that will provide the perfect cover for his action. A moment when a single actor is on stage, delivering a laugh line so potent it is guaranteed to produce a wave of hilarity from the audience. A wave of sound that will swallow the crack of a pistol. He finishes his drink, steps out into the alley, and re-enters the theater. He walks with the confident stride of a leading man about to make his entrance. He climbs the stairs to the dress circle, his footsteps silent on the carpeted floor. He moves along the back wall, a phantom in the dim light, toward the white door of the presidential box. He can see the back of the president's head, just above the rocking chair. He can see the other occupants, relaxed, engrossed in the comedy on stage. He reaches the door. There is a guard, a Washington police officer named John Frederick Parker, who is supposed to be sitting on a chair just outside, but the chair is empty. Parker, bored with the play and believing the president to be perfectly safe in a city wild with celebration, has left his post. He has gone to the same saloon Booth just left, to get a drink with the president's coachman. The path is clear. Booth pauses. He can hear the actors on stage. He knows the line is coming. Inside the box, Abraham Lincoln leans forward, resting his arm on the railing, trying to get a better look at the stage. He turns slightly to his wife, and she reaches out, taking his hand in hers. The world outside this small velvet-draped space does not exist. There is only the warmth of his wife's hand, the flickering lights, the sound of laughter, and the promise of a peaceful future. Outside the door, John Wilkes Booth reaches into his pocket. He pulls out a small single dash-shot .44 caliber Derringer pistol. It is a simple, easily concealable weapon, but at this range, it is brutally effective. He holds it in his right hand. In his left, he holds a large Bowie knife, a secondary weapon for the chaos he knows will follow. He takes a breath. The actor on stage is about to speak. The audience leans in, anticipating the joke. The knight is poised on the edge of a razor, a single moment, suspended in time between the end of one war and the beginning of a new and far more personal American tragedy. To understand the cataclysm of April 14th, one must first understand the man who willed it into being. John Wilkes Booth was not a madman in the clinical sense. His actions were not the product of a sudden, inexplicable psychosis. They were the culmination of a life steeped in theatricality, Southern romanticism, and a profound, curdling political hatred. He was a man who saw himself as a hero in a grand, sweeping drama, a Brutus for a new age, destined to strike down a tyrant and save his republic. The irony, of course, is that he was born not to politics, but to the stage. He was the 9th of 10 children of Junius Brutus Booth, an eccentric but brilliant British Shakespearean actor who had become a legend in America. The Booth family was acting royalty. His elder brother Edwin was considered the finest actor of his generation, a master of nuance and subtlety. John Wilkes, by contrast, was known for his raw physical and intensely emotional style. He was breathtakingly handsome, with flashing dark eyes and athletic grace and a rich, resonant voice. Women adored him. Audiences were captivated by his passionate, almost feral energy on stage. He was a sensation, a star in his own right, earning the modern equivalent of over $500,000 a year by the early 1860s. He had fame, fortune, and the adoration of the public, but he was haunted by a deep-seated insecurity, a constant, gnawing comparison to his more artistically respected brother Edwin. While Edwin was the cerebral Hamlet, John Wilkes was the swashbuckling hero, the romantic lead. He craved a legacy that transcended the ephemeral applause of the theater. He yearned for a place in history, a deed that would make his name immortal. His politics provided the stage for this ambition. The Booths were a Maryland family, a border state with divided loyalties. While most of his family, including Edwin, were staunch Unionists, John Wilkes's sympathies lay entirely with the South. He was intoxicated by the Southern ideal of chivalry, honor, and aristocracy. He saw the Confederacy not as a rebellion founded on the preservation of human bondage, but as a noble cause, a second American Revolution fought for liberty against a tyrannical, overreaching federal government. And the personification of that tyranny in his mind was Abraham Lincoln. Booth's hatred for Lincoln was an obsession. He saw him as an uneducated, uncouth buffoon, a guerrilla and a village tyrant who was systematically destroying the Constitution. He loathed Lincoln's policies, particularly the Emancipation Proclamation, which he viewed as an unholy incitement of slave rebellion. He was a fervent believer in white supremacy, writing in his diary that the United States was formed for the white, not for the black man. He saw the war not as a struggle to preserve the Union, but as a monstrous crime perpetrated by Lincoln against the Southern people. This political fervor was not just idle talk. In 1859, he had secretly joined a Virginia militia, the Richmond Greys, and traveled to Charlestown to witness the execution of the abolitionist John Brown. While he condemned Brown's violent methods, he admired his audacity, his willingness to die for his beliefs. It was a model of martyrdom that would stick with him. As the Civil War raged, Booth's acting career continued to flourish, but his mind was increasingly consumed by the conflict. He used his profession as a cover, traveling freely between the North and South, and is believed to have acted as a low-level courier and spy for the Confederacy, smuggling medical supplies like quinine across the lines. But these small acts of service were not enough. He yearned for a grander gesture. By late 1864, with the Confederacy on the brink of collapse, his desperation grew. He began to formulate a plan, a plot so audacious it bordered on the fantastic. He would not kill the president. Instead, he would kidnap him. The plan was to abduct Lincoln from Washington, smuggle him across the Potomac River into Virginia, and deliver him to Richmond. There, he could be held hostage, exchanged for thousands of captured Confederate soldiers who could then rejoin the fight and turn the tide of the war. It was a desperate, theatrical scheme, born from the mind of a man accustomed to dramatic plot twists. To carry out this plan, he needed accomplices. He began to assemble a small motley crew of Confederate sympathizers in Washington. There was David Harold, a young, impressionable drugstore clerk who knew the backwoods of southern Maryland like the back of his hand. There was George Atzerodt, a German-born carriage painter and boatman, whose knowledge of the Potomac would be crucial for the escape. And there was Lewis Powell, a towering, physically powerful former Confederate soldier who had been wounded at Gettysburg. Powell, using the alias Payne, was the muscle of the operation, a quiet, brooding young man of immense strength and unquestioning loyalty to Booth. They met frequently at the Washington boarding house of Mary Surratt, a Southern sympathizer and widow whose son, John Surratt, was a Confederate courier and a key member of Booth's conspiracy. The boarding house became their headquarters, a nest of intrigue in the heart of the Union capital. Booth financed the entire operation himself, spending thousands of dollars on supplies, weapons, and bribes. They made several attempts to put their plan into action. Their most concrete plan was set for March 17, 1865. Booth had learned that Lincoln was scheduled to attend a play for wounded soldiers at Campbell Hospital, on the outskirts of Washington. The plan was to ambush the president's carriage on its way back to the White House, overpower him, and spirit him away into Maryland. Booth and his co-conspirators lay in wait on the quiet country road, but the president never came. At the last minute, Lincoln had changed his plans, deciding instead to attend a ceremony at the National Hotel, the very hotel where Booth himself was staying. The kidnapping plot had failed. Booth was furious, his frustration mounting. The window for his grand gesture was closing. Then came the news that shattered his world. On April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. The war was over. Richmond had fallen. The cause was lost. For most of the nation, it was a moment of profound joy and relief. For John Wilkes Booth, it was a catastrophe. His kidnapping plot was now meaningless. There were no prisoners to exchange, no Confederate army to reinforce. His dream of saving the South was dead. His hatred, however, was not. It metastasized, transforming from a desperate desire to capture the president into a burning, vengeful need to destroy him. On the evening of April 11th, 2 days after the surrender, a large crowd gathered on the lawn of the White House. Lincoln appeared at a second-story window to deliver a speech. It was not a speech of triumph or conquest. It was a thoughtful, forward-looking address about the difficult process of bringing the nation back together, focusing on the reconstruction of Louisiana. In the speech, for the first time, Lincoln publicly endorsed the idea of giving the right to vote to some African Americans, specifically, the very intelligent, and on those who serve our cause as soldiers. John Wilkes Booth was in the crowd that night, standing on the White House lawn. He had come with Lewis Powell and David Harold, perhaps with some vague, half-formed idea of making an attempt on Lincoln's life right then and there. But it was Lincoln's words that pushed him over the edge. Hearing the president advocate for black suffrage, Booth turned to his companions in a fury. "That means nigger citizenship," he seethed. "Now by God I'll put him through. That is the last speech he will ever make." The actor had found his final act. The plot was no longer about kidnapping. It was about assassination. It would be a decapitation strike. A blow so devastating it would throw the Union government into chaos, and perhaps inspire the defeated South to rise again from the ashes. He would not just kill Lincoln. He would also target Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William H. Seward. By eliminating the top three figures in the line of presidential succession, he hoped to create a power vacuum that would paralyze the federal government. The grand kidnapping scheme was now a tripartite assassination plot. Booth assigned the roles with the authority of a stage director. Lewis Powell, the formidable ex-soldier, would be tasked with killing Secretary Seward, who was at home, bedridden from a serious carriage accident. George Atzerodt, the boatman, was given the job of assassinating Vice President Johnson, who was staying at the Kirkwood House Hotel. And Booth, the star of the show, reserved the lead role for himself. He would kill the tyrant, Abraham Lincoln. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place on the morning of Good Friday, April 14th. Around noon, Booth went to Ford's Theater to pick up his mail. While there, he overheard a theater employee say that the President and General Grant would be attending that night's performance of Our American Cousin. The opportunity was perfect. It was a public place, yet one where he had unparalleled access and knowledge. He knew the building, the play, the people. He could move about freely, without suspicion. The stage was literally set for his final terrible performance. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of activity. He went to the stable to get the small, swift mare he had arranged for his escape. He met with Powell and Atzerodt, informing them of the new plan and their targets. Atzerodt, a man of weak constitution, balked at the idea of murder, but Booth browbeat him into submission. He returned to his room at the National Hotel, where he wrote his final letters, including the one to the newspaper, a justification for his act. He signed it with the names of all the conspirators, a final defiant gesture of shared purpose. Then he went back to Ford's Theater. In the deserted auditorium, he made one final crucial preparation. He went to the vestibule that led to the state box. He bored a small peephole in the door of the outer chamber, so he could see into the box and time his entrance perfectly. He also carved a small mortise in the plaster wall next to the door, into which he could jam a wooden bar, barricading the door from the inside and preventing anyone from following him. All was in readiness. As evening fell, he dressed himself in a fine black suit. He armed himself with the Derringer pistol and the Bowie knife. He was calm, composed, filled with a sense of historic purpose. He was no longer just John Wilkes Booth, the actor. He was an instrument of divine vengeance, a patriot about to perform a sacred duty. As he rode his horse through the celebrating streets of Washington toward Ford's Theater, he was not just a man on his way to commit a murder. He was an actor, heading to the theater for the performance of his life, a performance he believed would echo through the ages. The plot that culminated on the night of April 14th was not the work of a lone, deranged individual. It was a conspiracy, albeit a small and often inept one, driven by the magnetic, domineering personality of John Wilkes Booth. He was the sun around which a handful of disaffected, marginalized, and fanatical individuals orbited. They were his supporting cast, the instruments he would use to carry out his grand, terrible design. Understanding them is to understand the chaotic, desperate energy that propelled the events of that fateful day. The most formidable of Booth's acolytes was Lewis Powell. Born in Alabama, Powell was a giant of a young man, standing over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and a brooding intensity. He had enlisted in the Confederate Army at the age of 17 and fought with distinction, seeing brutal combat at Antietam and Gettysburg, where he was wounded and captured. He escaped from a Union hospital in Baltimore and made his way to a shadowy world of Confederate sympathizers and spies. It was here, in the winter of 1864, that he was introduced to John Wilkes Booth. Powell was a man of action, not words. He was quiet, almost sullen, but possessed a fierce, unwavering loyalty once his trust was earned. Booth, with his charm, confidence, and passionate rhetoric, easily won him over. Powell saw in Booth a charismatic leader who could give his life purpose again after the collapse of the Confederate cause. He became Booth's enforcer, his primary instrument of violence. He was utterly devoted, ready to follow Booth's commands without question. It was this chilling devotion that made Booth assign him the most difficult and bloody task, the assassination of Secretary of State William Seward. Then there was David Herold, a native of Washington, D.C. Herold was a slight, boyish 22-year-old who worked as a clerk in a pharmacy. He was flighty, impressionable, and somewhat dim-witted, but he possessed one invaluable skill. He was an avid outdoorsman and hunter, who knew every creek, swamp, and backroad of southern Maryland. This knowledge was essential for the original kidnapping plot, which required a swift escape route through friendly territory. Herold idolized the famous actor. He was starstruck, swept up in the glamour and excitement of being part of Booth's inner circle. He lacked the ideological fervor of Booth, or the grim determination of Powell, but his desire to please his hero made him a willing, if sometimes clueless, participant. His role was to guide the assassins to safety after their deeds were done. He was assigned to accompany Lewis Powell to the Seward home and then lead him out of the city to a rendezvous point with Booth in Maryland. The most reluctant conspirator was George Atzerodt, a German immigrant who worked as a carriage painter and ferryman in Port Tobacco, Maryland. Atzerodt was a heavy drinker and a man of little conviction. He had been recruited into the conspiracy primarily for his knowledge of the Potomac River, which would be used to transport the kidnapped Lincoln into Virginia. He was drawn to the plot by Booth's money and promises of glory, but he was fundamentally a petty criminal, not a political assassin. He was boastful and loud when drunk, but a coward at heart. When Booth changed the plan from kidnapping to murder on April 14th, Atzerodt was terrified. He was tasked with assassinating Vice President Andrew Johnson at the Kirkwood House Hotel. The assignment filled him with dread. He argued with Booth, insisting he had signed up to capture, not to kill. But Booth was a master manipulator. He played on Atzerodt's fears, threatening him, belittling his courage, and reminding him that it was too late to back out. Atzerodt, weak-willed and intimidated, reluctantly agreed to play his part, though his heart was never in it. The final key figure in this circle was Mary Surratt, a 42-year-old widow. She owned a tavern in Surrattsville, Maryland, and a boarding house on H Street in Washington. Her son John Surratt was a Confederate secret agent and one of Booth's earliest and most important recruits. While John was away on a mission for the Confederate government in the final weeks of the war, his mother's boarding house became the central meeting place for the conspirators. It was here that they gathered to talk, plan, and receive instructions from Booth. Mary Surratt's precise level of involvement has been a subject of historical debate for over a century. She maintained her innocence to the end, claiming she was merely a simple landlady who rented rooms, but the evidence suggests she was, at the very least, a willing facilitator. She knew Booth and the other conspirators well, delivered messages for them, and her tavern in Maryland was a crucial way station on their planned escape route. She was a devout Catholic and a fierce Southern sympathizer, and she provided a veneer of domestic respectability that helped shield the conspiracy from suspicion. The day of April 14th was a study in controlled chaos. With the news of Lincoln's planned theater visit, Booth's timeline accelerated dramatically. The long simmering plot had to be executed in a matter of hours. Around midday, Booth convened a final meeting. It's unclear if it was at Mary Surratt's boarding house or elsewhere, but it was then that he laid out the final murderous plan. Powell, Herold, and Atzerodt were given their specific assignments. The attacks were to be synchronized, occurring at approximately 10:15 p.m., the same time Booth planned to shoot Lincoln. The goal was to create maximum shock and governmental paralysis. After the meeting, the conspirators scattered to make their final preparations. Booth, as we know, went to Ford's Theater to prepare the presidential box and then to the stable to get his horse. His actions were methodical, precise, befitting the lead actor in a deadly play. Powell, meanwhile, prepared for a far messier, more brutal task. He armed himself with a Whitney revolver and a large, heavy knife. His target, William Seward, was not in a public place but in his own home on Lafayette Square, just across from the White House. Seward was an invalid, confined to his bed, recovering from a severe carriage accident that had left him with a broken arm and a fractured jaw, which was held together by a metal brace. The plan was for Powell to gain entry to the house by posing as a messenger from Seward's doctor, bringing medicine. Once inside, he would make his way to Seward's bedroom and kill him. David Herold's job was to wait outside with the horses, ready to guide Powell on the escape. George Atzerodt checked into the Kirkwood House, the same hotel where Vice President Johnson was staying. He took a room directly above Johnson's. He was armed with a pistol and a knife. His plan was simple: knock on the vice president's door, and when he answered, shoot him. But Atzerodt's resolve was already crumbling. After checking in, he went to the hotel bar and began to drink heavily. He asked the bartender about the vice president's habits, his questions so strange and suspicious that the bartender would later remember them clearly. He seemed to be trying to talk himself into the act, or perhaps talk himself out of it. While the men prepared for violence, Mary Surratt also had a role to play. That afternoon, she took a carriage to her tavern in Surrattsville, about 10 miles southeast of Washington. Before she left, Booth met with her and gave her a small package, later identified as a pair of field glasses, to deliver to the tavern keeper John Lloyd. She also told Lloyd to have 2 carbines, which had been hidden at the tavern for weeks, ready for collection that night. She told him it would be wanted soon. This errand was a crucial step in preparing the escape route for Booth and his accomplices. It ensured that weapons and supplies would be waiting for them after they fled the city. The pressure was immense. The plan was complex, relying on the precise timing and ruthless execution of 3 separate attacks by a group of men who were, for the most part, amateurs. Booth was the only one with the public profile and composure to move through the city without suspicion. Powell was a trained soldier, but he was undertaking a difficult infiltration. Surratt was a drunkard, losing his nerve. Herold was little more than a follower. It was a conspiracy built on a foundation of fanaticism, but held together by the singular, powerful will of John Wilkes Booth. As the sun began to set over Washington, the pieces were in motion. Powell and Herold rode their horses toward Lafayette Square. Surratt sat in a hotel bar drinking and wrestling with his conscience. Mary Surratt was on her way back to her boarding house in Washington, her part in the drama complete, and John Wilkes Booth, the actor turned assassin, was preparing for his entrance onto the stage at Ford's Theater. The city was bathed in the warm light of celebration, utterly oblivious to the network of murder and intrigue that was about to be unleashed in its very heart. The conspiracy, for all its flaws and internal weaknesses, was about to step out of the shadows and into the pages of history. The gaslights of Ford's Theater cast a warm, almost magical glow over the capacity crowd. The air hummed with anticipation and a shared sense of relief. The play, Our American Cousin, was a well-worn piece of theatrical fluff, a British comedy of manners centered on an uncouth but honest American who travels to England to claim his inheritance, much to the dismay of his aristocratic relatives. It was light, predictable, and perfectly suited to the celebratory mood of the audience. The star of the show was the renowned actress Laura Keene, who played the role of Florence Trenchard. The audience adored her, but tonight the real star was in the state box. The arrival of the presidential party had been the main event. Now, settled in their seats, they became part of the spectacle. The state box was located on the right side of the theater, above the stage. It was actually 2 boxes, numbers 7 and 8, with the partition between them removed to create a single larger parlor. It was lavishly decorated for the occasion. Treasury Guard flags were draped over the railing, and a framed engraving of George Washington was positioned at the center pillar. Inside, the furniture was simple: a small sofa, a few chairs, and the special horsehair rocking chair that had been brought from the personal quarters of the theater's owner, Harry Ford, for the president's comfort. Abraham Lincoln sat in this rocker, closest to the audience but angled away, facing the stage. To his right sat his wife, Mary. On the other side of the box, on a small sofa, sat their guests, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. From their vantage point, they had a perfect, unobstructed view of the stage. Lincoln, by all accounts, was in a relaxed and happy mood. He seemed to be genuinely enjoying the simple comedy. He laughed at the jokes, his distinct high-pitched laugh occasionally audible to those sitting nearby. During the performance he was seen to lean towards his wife, their hands touching, sharing quiet remarks. Major Rathbone would later testify that the president seemed to be in a happy and jovial state of mind. He had spent the evening in the company of his son Tad and old friends from Illinois. He had put aside the immense burdens of his office, if only for a few hours, to simply be a husband, a friend, and a citizen, enjoying a night out. The atmosphere was one of profound security. Here, in the heart of his capital city, surrounded by hundreds of loyal, adoring citizens, the president seemed untouchable. The war was won, the threats had seemingly vanished. This feeling of safety was tragically misplaced, and it was compounded by a single catastrophic failure of duty. The man assigned to guard the president that night was John Frederick Parker. Parker was a patrolman on the Washington Metropolitan Police Force, one of 4 officers assigned to the White House detail. His record was less than stellar. He had faced disciplinary action for being drunk on duty, sleeping on a streetcar when he should have been on patrol, and using foul language. He was, to put it mildly, an unreliable guardian. His post was a chair in the dimly lit passageway outside the first door to the presidential box. From there he was to control all access to the president. But Parker was bored. The play held no interest for him. During the intermission, he left his post and went next door to Taltaville's Star Saloon for a drink. He was accompanied by Lincoln's coachman and footman. In a staggering dereliction of duty, Parker did not return to his post for the third act. The chair outside the president's box sat empty. The one man standing between the president and an assassin had abandoned his watch. As the third act began, another man was moving through the theater with practiced ease. John Wilkes Booth had arrived sometime after 10 p.m. He dismounted from his horse in the alley behind the theater, and left her with a stagehand named Edmund Spangler, telling him he would only be a short while. He then went to the saloon next door, the same one where Parker was now drinking. Booth ordered a whiskey and some water, calming his nerves. He was a familiar and welcome sight to the staff and patrons. He was a star, and his presence caused a minor stir. After his drink, he walked back into the front lobby of the theater. He asked a clock for the time. It was a few minutes past 10. He knew the play intimately. He knew that one of the biggest laugh lines was fast approaching. It was a scene in which the formidable matriarch, Mrs. Mount Chessington, confronts the titular American cousin as a trencher about his lack of high society breeding. She exits in a huff, leaving Eza alone on stage to deliver the line that would bring down the house. Booth began his final approach. He entered the dress circle, the second level of the theater, and began to walk slowly along the carpeted passageway behind the audience. He was in no hurry. He moved with a quiet, deliberate confidence. Several people recognized him, but his presence aroused no suspicion. He was an actor. This was his world. He reached the white door that led to the vestibule of the state box. He paused, listening. He could hear the dialogue from the stage. He knew his moment was near. He opened the outer door and stepped into the small, dark vestibule. He closed the door behind him. Now he was in the private entryway to the president's box. He reached for the wooden bar he had prepared earlier in the day, and jammed it into the mortise he had carved in the wall, barricading the door. No one could get in from the outside. He then crept to the second door, the one that opened directly into the box itself. He put his eye to the small peephole he had drilled that afternoon. The view was perfect. He could see the back of Lincoln's head, silhouetted against the light from the stage. The president was leaning slightly forward, and to his left, his head turned as he looked down toward the orchestra. He seemed to be trying to locate someone in the crowd. Rathbone and Miss Harris were on the far side of the box, engrossed in the play. Mary Lincoln was seated close to her husband. The scene on stage was building to its comedic climax. The actress playing Mrs. Mount Chessington delivered her indignant lines and swept off stage. Now the actor Harry Hawke, playing Asa Trenchard, was alone. He delivered the famous line, a retort to the insult he had just received. "Don't know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal. You sock-dologizing old man-trap." It was a terrible joke by modern standards, but in 1865 it was a guaranteed showstopper. As Hawke delivered the line, the theater erupted. A wave of laughter, loud and sustained, rolled through the auditorium. It was the sound Booth had been waiting for. It was the perfect acoustic cover. In that moment, as 1,700 people were distracted by a piece of stage comedy, John Wilkes Booth pushed open the door to the box. He took 2 silent steps forward. No one saw him. No one heard him. The occupants of the box were all looking at the stage, their attention captured by the play. Major Rathbone, from the corner of his eye, may have registered a dark figure entering, perhaps assuming it was a messenger. Booth raised the .44 caliber Derringer. It was a small pistol, but he was standing less than 5 feet behind the president. He aimed at the back of Lincoln's head, just behind the left ear. He squeezed the trigger. The sound of the shot was not a deafening boom. It was a sharp, muffled pop, almost entirely swallowed by the roar of laughter from the audience. To many it sounded like a door slamming or a prop misfiring on stage. But inside the box, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The small, soft lead ball tore through the president's skull, plowing through his brain and coming to rest behind his right eye. Abraham Lincoln's body went rigid for a moment, and then slumped forward in the rocking chair. His head fell to his chest. He made no sound. He never knew what hit him. For a split second, there was a strange, surreal silence in the box, a pocket of horror amidst the sea of merriment outside. Mary Lincoln was the first to realize something was wrong, though she did not understand what. She saw her husband slump and reached for him. Major Rathbone, a trained soldier, reacted instantly. He turned and saw Booth standing in a cloud of white pistol smoke, a wild, triumphant look in his eyes. Rathbone lunged at him, but Booth was ready. He dropped the now useless pistol, and brought up the large bowie knife he held in his other hand. He slashed viciously at Rathbone, inflicting a deep 9-inch gash on the major's upper left arm, from his elbow to his shoulder, severing an artery. Despite the grievous wound, Rathbone continued to grapple with Booth, trying to push him away from the president and toward the railing of the box. But Booth was strong and athletic. He broke free from Rathbone's grasp. For a moment he stood poised on the railing, a dramatic silhouetted figure against the bright stage lights, 12 feet above the stage. He was now the center of attention. The laughter in the audience had died down, replaced by a confused murmur. The actor on stage, Harry Hawk, stared up at the box in bewilderment. The audience looked up, trying to comprehend the sudden commotion. John Wilkes Booth, the actor, seized his final moment in the spotlight. He leaped from the box, a theatrical, daring escape, but his spur caught on the Treasury Guard flag draped over the railing. The flag tore, but it was enough to throw him off balance. He landed awkwardly on the stage below, his full weight coming down on his left leg. He felt a sharp, sickening snap just above his ankle. His fibula was broken, pain shot through him, but adrenaline and a lifetime of stage training took over. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the searing agony in his leg. He brandished his bloody knife at the stunned actor and the confused audience, and then, in a clear, dramatic voice that carried throughout the theater, he shouted the state motto of Virginia, the words that Brutus supposedly uttered after assassinating Julius Caesar: Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants. Some in the audience also reported hearing him add, "The South is avenged." Then he limped across the stage, a strange, hobbling figure, brandishing his knife at anyone who dared to approach. He disappeared through a side door, into the backstage labyrinth he knew so well. In the presidential box, chaos had erupted. Mary Lincoln finally understood. She let out a piercing scream of terror and grief that cut through the stunned silence of the theater. "He has shot the president," she cried. The night of celebration had ended. The curtain had fallen, not on a comedy, but on a national nightmare. The moment hung suspended, a tableau of disbelief. Below on the stage, the actor Harry Hawk stood frozen, his comic lines forgotten, staring at the dark figure who had just landed before him. The audience, their laughter caught in their throats, craned their necks, their minds struggling to process the scene. Was this part of the play? A drunken prank? The man on stage was John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor. Perhaps this was some unscheduled dramatic flourish. But the bloody knife in his hand was no prop, and the scream that now echoed from the state box was no performance. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated horror. Clara Harris, in the box, screamed, "The president is shot." Major Rathbone, blood now pouring from the deep wound in his arm, shouted, "Stop that man." The confusion in the auditorium ignited into panic. People began to rise from their seats, shouting, pointing. The illusion of the theater was shattered, replaced by a terrifying reality. In the box, the scene was one of grim, intimate chaos. Lincoln had slumped forward, his chin resting on his chest. He was unconscious, but still breathing, in slow, ragged gasps. Mary Lincoln was hysterical, alternately cradling her husband's head and screaming for help. Major Rathbone, despite his own severe injury, tried to assess the president's condition, but he could see no wound. He thought perhaps the president had been stabbed. He then tried to force open the door to the vestibule to get help, but it was barred shut from the outside by the wooden plank Booth had wedged in place. He shouted for someone to open it. Down below, the theater was turning into a madhouse. Several men in the audience, realizing what had happened, surged toward the stage. Joseph B. Stewart, a lawyer, was one of the first to react. He scrambled over the footlights and gave chase, pursuing the limping figure of Booth backstage. But Booth knew the theater's layout perfectly. He shoved past stunned stagehands and actors, out a back door into the alley where his horse was waiting. Edmund Spangler, the stagehand holding the horse, was caught off guard. Booth snatched the reins, slashed at another man who tried to stop him, and mounted the mare. He spurred the horse viciously, clattering out of the alley and disappearing into the dark Washington night. The entire assassination, from the moment Booth entered the box to his escape from the theater, had taken less than 2 minutes. Back in the state box, several men had finally managed to force open the jammed door. The first to enter was a young Union Army surgeon, Dr. Charles Leal, who had been in the audience. He was only 23 years old, just 6 weeks out of medical school, but he was calm and methodical. He pushed past the frantic Mary Lincoln and the bleeding Major Rathbone, his focus entirely on the slumped figure in the rocking chair. "I am a surgeon," he announced, taking command of the scene. "Let me in." At first, like Rathbone, Leal could find no wound. He saw no blood on Lincoln's clothes. He quickly laid the president on the floor, believing he may have suffered a stroke or a seizure. He and 2 other doctors who had made their way to the box, Dr. Charles Taft and Dr. Albert King, began to unbutton Lincoln's collar and shirt, searching for a knife wound near the heart. They found nothing. It was then that Dr. Leal, running his fingers through the president's thick, coarse hair, felt a small, matted clot of blood behind his left ear. He probed gently. His finger found a small, perfectly round hole. It was a bullet wound. Leal knew instantly the situation was hopeless. "His wound is mortal," he declared to the stunned onlookers. "It is impossible for him to recover." The bullet from Booth's Derringer had entered a part of the brain that controlled the body's vital functions. The damage was catastrophic and irreversible. Lincoln's breathing was becoming shallower, his pulse weaker. A blood clot was forming, putting pressure on the brain. Dr. Leal, in a desperate attempt to relieve the pressure and prolong the president's life, inserted his little finger into the wound to dislodge the clot. The president's breathing immediately improved, but it was a temporary measure. The President of the United States was dying. The question now became what to do. The doctors agreed that Lincoln could not survive the rough, rattling carriage ride back to the White House. He needed to be taken somewhere close, somewhere he could lie down. A call went out into the crowd that had gathered on 10th Street, a mixture of horrified theatergoers and curious passers-by drawn by the commotion. Bring him somewhere. Take him to the nearest house. A man standing on the steps of a modest boarding house directly across the street gestured to the open door. He was a tailor named William Peterson. Several soldiers carefully lifted the president's long, limp body. It was an awkward, heartbreaking procession. They carried him out of the theater, down the stairs and into the street, which was now a chaotic scene of shouting people and flickering lanterns. The crowd parted in horrified silence as they saw the president's pale, unconscious face. They carried him across the cobblestones of 10th Street and into the Peterson house. The house was small and narrow. They moved through the front parlor and into a small bedroom at the back of the first floor. The room was tiny, meant for a single boarder, a Union soldier named William Clark, who was out for the night. The bed was far too short for the 6'4" president. They had to lay him diagonally across it, his feet hanging off the end. And so in this small, humble room, surrounded by cheap wallpaper and the meager belongings of a common soldier, the President of the United States was brought to die. While the drama unfolded at Ford's Theater, Booth's wider conspiracy was playing out with a mixture of brutal violence and pathetic failure across the city. At the same time Booth was firing his pistol, Lewis Powell was arriving at the home of Secretary of State William Seward. He was accompanied by David Herold, who waited outside with the horses. Powell, posing as a messenger from the doctor, knocked on the door. He was met by Seward's butler, William Bell. Powell insisted he had medicine that had to be delivered to Seward in person. Bell was suspicious and refused him entry. Powell pushed past him and began to climb the stairs toward the second floor. He was confronted on the landing by Seward's son Frederick, the Assistant Secretary of State. Frederick also denied him access to his father's room. Powell, realizing his ruse had failed, resorted to brute force. He pulled out his revolver, aimed it at Frederick's head, and pulled the trigger. The gun misfired with a dull click. Powell then used the heavy pistol as a club, smashing it into Frederick's head with such force that the younger Seward's skull was fractured in 2 places. He collapsed, unconscious and bleeding profusely. Powell then burst into the secretary's bedroom. Inside were Seward and his daughter Fanny. Powell threw himself upon the bedridden secretary, pulling out his knife and stabbing wildly at Seward's head and throat. The secretary, weakened by his injuries, could do little to defend himself. But the metal brace he wore on his jaw, a result of his carriage accident, saved his life. It deflected many of Powell's knife slashes, preventing a fatal blow. Seward's son Augustus and a soldier nurse, Sergeant George Robinson, rushed into the room. They grappled with the powerful assailant. In the struggle both Augustus and Robinson were stabbed and seriously wounded. Fanny Seward's screams alerted David Herold, waiting outside. Panicked by the sounds of the struggle, Herold abandoned his post, fleeing on his horse and leaving Powell to fend for himself. Powell, having wounded 5 people in a matter of minutes, finally broke free. He ran down the stairs, stabbed a State Department messenger who had just arrived, and burst out of the house shouting, "I'm mad, I'm mad." He found Herold gone. Unfamiliar with the city, he untied his horse and galloped off in the wrong direction, lost and alone. The attack was a bloodbath, but it had failed. William Seward, though grievously wounded, was still alive. Miles away, at the Kirkwood house, the third part of the conspiracy was collapsing into a drunken farce. George Atzerodt, tasked with killing Vice President Andrew Johnson, had lost his nerve completely. He had spent the evening drinking in the hotel bar, trying to build his courage, but to no avail. He never even made an attempt to go to Johnson's room. Instead, he abandoned his mission entirely. He wandered out of the hotel and into the streets, eventually ditching his knife and pistol. He was a pathetic figure, a would-be assassin who could not bring himself to act. By 10:30 p.m., the grand three-pronged plot to decapitate the Union government was in tatters. Seward was alive. Johnson was untouched. Only one part of the plan had succeeded. But that one success was so profound, so devastating, that it would change the course of American history. In the small back bedroom of the Peterson house, a death watch had begun. The room was now crowded with cabinet members, senators, and high-ranking army officers who had been summoned by the terrible news. Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton arrived and immediately took charge, turning the adjacent parlor into a makeshift command center. He began issuing orders, dispatching troops to guard the city, and launching a full-scale investigation and manhunt. The mood was somber, tense, and filled with a profound sense of grief and disbelief. The doctors could do nothing more for the president. They could only monitor his fading pulse and labored breathing. Mary Lincoln was in the front parlor, overcome with grief, her periodic sobs echoing through the small house. Robert Todd Lincoln, the president's eldest son, arrived and stood by his father's bedside, weeping. Through the long, dark hours of the night, the leaders of the nation kept their vigil, watching as the life slowly, inexorably, ebbed from the man who had led them through their darkest trial. The shot in the dark had not just struck down a man, it had struck down the hope of a peaceful, magnanimous reconciliation. In its place, it had sown chaos, fear, and a burning desire for vengeance. The news spread through Washington like a contagion. It traveled first by word of mouth, a panicked whisper carried out of Ford's Theater by horrified witnesses. The president has been shot. The rumor leaped from person to person, from street corner to street corner, amplified by the frantic ringing of church bells that began to toll across the city. At first, there was disbelief. It was too monstrous, too unthinkable. In an era before mass communication, verification was slow, but as soldiers began to gallop through the streets, as government officials were seen rushing towards 10th Street, the terrible truth began to sink in. The city, which only hours before had been a beacon of celebration, was plunged into a state of shock and terror. The bonfires of joy were extinguished, replaced by the flickering, uncertain light of torches and lanterns as crowds began to gather in the streets. They converged on 10th Street, a massive, silent, anxious throng held back by a line of soldiers. They stood in the rain that had begun to fall, their faces upturned towards the humble brick house where their leader lay dying. Their collective joy curdled into a shared, national grief. Fear was a palpable thing in the city that night. The scope of the conspiracy was unknown. Was this a lone act, or the first strike in a new Confederate offensive? Was the city under attack? Rumors flew wildly. General Grant, who had left the city that afternoon, was rumored to have been assassinated on his train. The entire cabinet was said to have been targeted. Washington, the seat of a victorious government, suddenly felt like a city under siege. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, operating out of the front parlor of the Peterson house, became the de facto head of government. Stanton was a man of immense energy and iron will, and he moved with decisive force to restore order and launch a manhunt. He dispatched telegrams across the country, alerting military commanders and police departments. He ordered the closure of all roads and bridges leading out of Washington, though the order came too late to stop Booth. He began interviewing witnesses who were brought, one by one, into the crowded parlor, methodically piecing together the events of the night. He was a rock of stability in a sea of chaos, his gruff, commanding presence a bulwark against the rising tide of panic. Inside the small back bedroom, the scene was more somber, a sacred space of quiet sorrow. The room was dimly lit by a single gas lamp. The only sounds were the president's labored rhythmic breathing and the quiet weeping of those who kept the vigil. The bed was surrounded by the most powerful men in the country: Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, Secretary of the Interior John Palmer Usher, Attorney General James Speed, Postmaster General William Dennison, and Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, one of Lincoln's closest friends and confidants. Sumner sat by the bed for hours, holding the president's hand. General Henry Halleck, the Army's chief of staff, stood grimly in a corner. The doctors monitored the president's condition, but they were helpless. The bullet was lodged too deep in his brain to be removed. There was no surgery, no medicine that could save him. All they could do was wait. Gideon Welles, in his famous diary, captured the profound sadness of the scene. He described Lincoln's breathing as regular, but stertorous, a heavy snoring sound that filled the small room. He noted the president's face was pale, and his large features were relaxed and calm. He looked, Welles wrote, as if in a profound sleep. Throughout the night, a steady stream of officials and friends came to pay their last respects. Mary Lincoln, sequestered in the front parlor, was periodically brought to her husband's bedside, but her overwhelming grief was too disruptive for the solemn atmosphere of the death room, and she would be gently led away again. Her son, Robert, a young captain on General Grant's staff, stood stoically by his father's side for hours, a portrait of youthful grief trying to maintain military composure in the face of an unspeakable family tragedy. As the hours ticked by, the president's condition deteriorated. His breathing became shallower, his pulse weaker. The doctors knew the end was near. The nation was holding its breath. Meanwhile, the assassin was making his escape. John Wilkes Booth, his broken leg causing him excruciating pain, rode furiously through the darkened streets of Washington. He was heading for the Navy Yard Bridge, the main route out of the city and into southern Maryland. The bridge was supposed to have been closed by military order at 9 p.m., but the sentry on duty, Sergeant Silas T. Cobb, had not yet received the order. When Booth galloped up, Cobb challenged him. Booth, thinking quickly, gave his real name and said he was heading home to Charles County. Cobb, perhaps swayed by Booth's confident, gentlemanly demeanor, or perhaps simply lax in his duties, let him pass. It was a critical failure that allowed the assassin to slip out of the city. A few minutes later, David Herold, fleeing the scene of the Seward attack, also arrived at the bridge. He too was allowed to cross. The two conspirators met up on the Maryland side as planned. Booth, his leg now swelling badly, told Herold what he had done. Together they rode into the night, heading for Surrattsville, where Mary Surratt had arranged for them to pick up weapons and supplies. They were now fugitives, with the full might of the United States military beginning to mobilize against them. Their flight was a desperate, painful journey through a landscape of sympathizers and betrayers. They stopped first at the Surratt Tavern, where they collected the carbines and a bottle of whiskey. Booth, unable to hide his triumphant glee, told the tavern keeper, "I am pretty certain that we have assassinated the President and Secretary Seward." From there they rode on to the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, a local physician with known Southern sympathies. They arrived in the pre-dawn hours. Mudd, roused from his sleep, set Booth's broken leg, fashioning a crude splint. Booth's injury was a serious impediment to his escape. It made riding a horse agonizing, and would force him to rely heavily on Herold and a network of Confederate sympathizers for help. He could no longer flee with the speed he had planned. The manhunt, the largest in American history to that point, was beginning to take shape. Stanton's telegrams had alerted the entire country. Descriptions of Booth were being circulated. Thousands of soldiers were being deployed to scour the countryside of southern Maryland and Virginia. The price on Booth's head would eventually reach $100,000, an astronomical sum. The nation was not just grieving, it was enraged. The initial shock was giving way to a burning desire for justice, for retribution. The magnanimous spirit of reconciliation that Lincoln had championed just days before was being consumed by a wave of anger and suspicion. In Washington, as dawn approached on Saturday, April 15th, the rain stopped. A gray, somber light filtered into the small room at the Peterson house. The president's breathing grew fainter, more irregular. The end was imminent. The assembled men drew closer to the bed. Mary Lincoln was brought in for a final time. At 22 minutes past 7 o'clock in the morning, Abraham Lincoln drew his last, shuddering breath. Dr. Leal held a silver probe to his lips. There was no telltale vapor. He felt for a pulse. There was none. He gently closed the president's eyes. He had crossed, as the poet would later write, the silent sea. A profound silence fell over the room. After a long moment, the silence was broken by the solemn, tear-choked voice of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. The precise words he spoke have been debated by historians. Some say he uttered the simple, profound phrase, "Now he belongs to the ages." Others reported it as, "Now he belongs to the angels." Whatever the exact words, the sentiment was clear. The man who had occupied the office of president, the husband and father, was gone. What remained was the martyr, the legend, the historical figure who now belonged not to his time, but to all time. The vigil was over. The cabinet members filed out of the room, their faces etched with grief and the heavy weight of the future. A nation, newly reunited, was now a nation without a leader, adrift in a sea of uncertainty and sorrow. The immediate consequence was the transfer of power. A few hours later, at the Kirkwood House, the same hotel where George Atzerodt had failed in his mission, Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase administered the oath of office to Vice President Andrew Johnson. Johnson, a Tennessee Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union, was now the 17th President of the United States. He was a man of starkly different temperament and political philosophy than his predecessor, a fact that would have enormous and tragic consequences for the future of the nation. The body of the fallen president was wrapped in an American flag and carried by a solemn honor guard of soldiers back across the street, not to the theater, but to a waiting hearse. As the hearse began its slow journey up Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House, the crowds that had kept vigil all night watched in stunned silence, many openly weeping. The American experiment had faced its greatest test in the Civil War. Now it faced a new and terrible crisis: how to heal, how to rebuild, how to live up to the legacy of a leader who had preached malice toward none, in a nation suddenly consumed by it. The death of Abraham Lincoln did not end the crisis. It began a new, more chaotic phase. The nation was plunged into a period of profound mourning, unlike anything it had ever experienced. But beneath the grief, a furious and determined manhunt was underway, a 12-day epic of flight, pursuit, and eventual justice that captivated and terrified a wounded country. The search for John Wilkes Booth and his co-conspirators was a massive undertaking, personally directed by the tireless Edwin Stanton. The War Department put up a $100,000 reward for the capture of Booth, David Herold, and John Surratt, who was correctly, though belatedly, identified as a key conspirator. This massive sum ignited a frenzy of activity. Thousands of troops, detectives, and civilian volunteers fanned out across the region. Every road was watched, every boat on the Potomac inspected, every thicket and swamp in southern Maryland probed. The dragnet was vast, but the fugitives had a head start, and initially, a network of support. Booth and Herold's journey was a desperate odyssey, through a landscape of fear and divided loyalties. After leaving Dr. Mudd's farm, where Booth's leg had been set, they continued their flight southward. Booth's injury was a constant, agonizing torment. He could no longer ride his horse for long periods, and had to be supported by Herold. They were forced to hide during the day, and travel only at night, relying on a chain of Confederate sympathizers to provide them with food, shelter, and guidance. They were aided by men like Thomas Jones, a former Confederate agent who hid them for 5 crucial days in a dense pine thicket near the Potomac River, while Union patrols scoured the area around them. Jones brought them food and newspapers. It was here, hiding in the woods like a hunted animal, that Booth read the first accounts of his crime. He was stunned and horrified by the universal condemnation. In his theatrical worldview, he had expected to be hailed as a hero, a liberator, a modern-day Brutus. Instead, the newspapers, even in the South, denounced him as a vile coward and a common murderer. The adulation he craved had turned to infamy. He recorded his anguish in a small diary he carried with him. "I am here in despair," he wrote. "And why? For doing what Brutus was honored for. And yet I, for striking down a greater tyrant than they ever knew, am looked upon as a common cutthroat." He could not comprehend that the nation, North and South, saw Lincoln not as a tyrant, but as a martyr, a symbol of a lost hope for a gentle peace. While Booth and Herold were hiding, the authorities in Washington were rounding up the rest of the conspiracy. The investigation moved with incredible speed. Lewis Powell, lost and alone after the botched attack on Seward, made a fatal mistake. After hiding for 3 days, he made his way back to Mary Surratt's boarding house, hoping to find sanctuary. He arrived on the night of April 17th, at the exact moment that federal detectives were there to arrest Mrs. Surratt. When he knocked on the door, claiming to be a laborer hired to dig a gutter, his story quickly fell apart. He was arrested on the spot. George Atzerodt was captured on April 20th at his cousin's home in Maryland. He had been boasting about his involvement in the plot, and his loose talk led authorities directly to him. Others, like the stagehand Edmund Spangler who had held Booth's horse, and Dr. Samuel Mudd who had set his leg, were also taken into custody. The net was closing. Mary Surratt was arrested and imprisoned, her boarding house identified as the nest where the conspiracy was hatched. The dragnet pulled in dozens of individuals, anyone with the slightest connection to Booth or the other known conspirators. Washington was a city on edge, rife with suspicion and a thirst for vengeance. On April 24th, after days of hiding, Thomas Jones finally judged it safe for Booth and Herold to attempt to cross the Potomac into Virginia. Under the cover of darkness, he led them to a small rowboat. They set off into the river, but in their haste and the darkness, they became disoriented and rowed in the wrong direction, landing back in Maryland miles from where they started. They had to hide for another full day before making a second, successful attempt. They finally landed in Virginia on April 23rd, exhausted, hungry, and with Booth in constant, debilitating pain. They had made it to the heart of the former Confederacy, a land Booth believed would welcome him as a hero. He was wrong. Virginia was a defeated and occupied territory. Its people were exhausted by war and wary of harboring the nation's most wanted fugitive. While they found some help from a few Confederate sympathizers, they were also met with fear and rejection. They were a liability, and no one wanted to be associated with the man who had murdered the president. The final act of the drama played out at the farm of a tobacco farmer named Richard Garrett, just south of Port Royal, Virginia. The Garretts, unaware of their guests' true identities, reluctantly agreed to let Booth and Harold stay in their tobacco barn, but their suspicions were soon aroused. By this time, the 16th New York Cavalry, a crack Union regiment, was closing in. Acting on a tip, they surrounded the Garrett farm in the early morning hours of April 26. The commander, Lieutenant Edward Doherty, called for the fugitives in the barn to surrender. Harold, losing his nerve, gave himself up, but Booth refused. He was defiant to the end, a cornered actor playing out his final scene. He tried to negotiate, to bargain for a fair fight. The Union soldiers, in no mood for games, set fire to the barn to smoke him out. The dry tobacco leaves and wooden slats of the barn went up in a roar of flames. In the flickering, hellish light, Booth could be seen through the gaps in the walls. He was armed with a carbine and his pistols, limping through the smoke and fire, a trapped, desperate figure. A soldier, a sergeant named Boston Corbett, peered through a crack in the barn wall. He saw Booth raise his carbine as if to fire on the soldiers outside. Corbett, a religious zealot who would later claim he acted on orders from God, raised his own rifle and fired. The bullet struck Booth in the neck, severing his spinal cord, almost in the same spot where his bullet had entered Lincoln's head. The wound was mortal. The soldiers dragged the paralyzed Booth from the burning barn and laid him on the porch of the Garrett farmhouse. He was conscious, but unable to move his limbs. He lingered for several hours, in agony. As the sun rose, he whispered to the doctor treating him, "Tell my mother I die for my country." A little later, looking at his paralyzed hands, he murmured, "Useless, useless." These were his last words. John Wilkes Booth died around 7 a.m. on April 26, 1865, 12 days after he had fired the fatal shot in Ford's Theater. His body was wrapped in a blanket, taken back to Washington, and secretly buried in an unmarked grave on the grounds of the Arsenal Penitentiary. His death marked the end of the manhunt, but not the end of the story. The nation's grief, meanwhile, was being channeled into a massive public spectacle of mourning. After a funeral service in the East Room of the White House, Lincoln's body began its final journey home. A funeral train, a 9-car procession draped in black, carried his coffin on a slow, winding, 700-mile trip back to Springfield, Illinois. It was the reverse of the route he had taken to Washington as president-elect in 1861. The train stopped in major cities along the way: Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Cleveland, Chicago. In each city, the coffin was taken off the train and placed in a public building for viewing. The scale of the public mourning was unprecedented. Millions of Americans, black and white, stood for hours in silent, solemn lines to catch a final glimpse of the face of their fallen leader. Those who could not see him in the cities gathered along the railroad tracks, in small towns and on lonely farms, standing in silent tribute as the funeral train passed. They built bonfires, sang hymns, and held up portraits of the martyred president. It was a shared national experience of loss, a collective ritual that helped bind the wounds of a divided country, even as the assassination itself threatened to tear them open again. The journey ended on May 4th, when Abraham Lincoln was finally laid to rest in Oak Ridge Cemetery in his hometown of Springfield. The long night was over, but the dawn would reveal a new, harsher political landscape. The man who had promised a reconstruction with malice toward none, with charity for all, was gone. In his place stood Andrew Johnson, and a Congress dominated by radical Republicans, who, inflamed by the assassination, were in no mood for charity. The bullet that killed Lincoln also killed the possibility of a lenient peace. The consequences of that single shot would shape the next decade of American history, leading to a period of bitter conflict, political impeachment, and a struggle for the soul of the nation that in many ways continues to this day. The manhunt had brought the killers to justice, but it could not restore the leader, or the future, they had stolen. With the death of John Wilkes Booth and the capture of his accomplices, the nation's attention turned from pursuit to punishment. The desire for vengeance was strong, and the government, under the firm hand of Edwin Stanton, was determined to deliver it swiftly and decisively. In May of 1865, just weeks after the assassination, 8 of the accused conspirators were put on trial in Washington. They were not tried in a civilian court, but before a military tribunal. The government argued that the assassination was an act of war, committed against the nation's commander-in-chief, and thus fell under military jurisdiction. This decision was controversial, as it denied the accused many of the protections of a civil trial, such as the right to a jury of their peers. But in the heated, vengeful atmosphere of post-assassination Washington, there was little appetite for legal nuance. The trial was a public spectacle. The 8 prisoners sat on a raised platform in a crowded courtroom, their wrists and ankles shackled. They were Lewis Powell, David Harold, George Atzerodt, Dr. Samuel Mudd, Michael O'Laval, Samuel Arnold, Edmund Spangler, and Mary Surratt. The evidence presented was overwhelming for some, circumstantial for others. Powell, Harold, and Atzerodt were clearly guilty. Their roles in the conspiracy were well documented. The cases against the others were more complex. Dr. Mudd insisted he was merely a country doctor who had treated a man with a broken leg, unaware of his identity or his crime. Spangler claimed he was an innocent stagehand who had been bullied by Booth. And Mary Surratt, the first woman ever tried by a federal military tribunal, maintained her complete innocence, her defense portraying her as a pious widow who had been unwittingly caught in Booth's web. The trial lasted for 7 weeks. On June 30th, the tribunal delivered its verdict. All 8 were found guilty. The sentences were severe. Powell, Harold, Atzerodt, and Mary Surratt were sentenced to death by hanging. Dr. Mudd, Samuel Arnold, and Michael O'Laval were sentenced to life in prison at the remote and brutal Fort Jefferson, a military prison in the dry Tortugas off the coast of Florida. Edmund Spangler received a 6-year sentence. The death sentence for Mary Surratt was particularly shocking to the public. Many, including some members of the tribunal itself, petitioned the new president, Andrew Johnson, to commute her sentence to life in prison, believing it was unseemly to execute a woman. But Johnson, a man who harbored a deep resentment for the Southern aristocracy he believed Surratt represented, refused to intervene. He was determined to make an example of her. On July 7, 1865, a sweltering summer day, the 4 condemned prisoners were led to a gallows erected in the courtyard of the old Arsenal Penitentiary. They were hooded, and nooses were placed around their necks. At the signal, the traps were sprung, and the 4 bodies dropped. The judgment of the military tribunal was complete. The assassination plot had been stamped out, its perpetrators brought to a grim and final justice. But the execution of the conspirators could not erase the profound and lasting consequences of their actions. The most immediate and significant legacy of the assassination was its devastating impact on the course of Reconstruction. Abraham Lincoln's vision for reuniting the nation was rooted in reconciliation and a swift restoration of the Southern states to the Union. He favored a lenient approach, believing that punishing the South would only prolong the bitterness and division. His 10% plan would have allowed a state to be readmitted to the Union once 10% of its voters took an oath of allegiance. He was a master politician, with the immense moral authority earned by winning the war, and he possessed the skill and the will to navigate the difficult political waters of Reconstruction, balancing the demands of Congress with the needs of a defeated South. His death removed that moderating influence. His successor, Andrew Johnson, shared Lincoln's desire for a quick restoration of the Southern states, but he lacked Lincoln's political skill, his moral authority, and his deep compassion. Johnson, a Southerner himself, was also a staunch white supremacist who had little interest in protecting the rights of the newly freed African Americans. He clashed violently with the radical Republicans in Congress, who, emboldened by the public outrage over the assassination, sought a much harsher Reconstruction. They saw the assassination as proof of the South's unrepentant treachery, and were determined to remake Southern society, punish former Confederates, and secure federal protection for the civil rights of freedmen. The result was a decade of bitter political warfare. Johnson's lenient policies were rejected by Congress, which passed its own, more stringent Reconstruction acts, placing the South under military rule. The conflict culminated in the impeachment of President Johnson in 1868. While he was acquitted by a single vote, his presidency was crippled. The Reconstruction that followed was a period of both remarkable progress and tragic failure. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution were passed, abolishing slavery, granting citizenship and equal protection to all persons born in the United States, and giving African American men the right to vote. But these gains were fiercely resisted. The rise of violent white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, and the eventual withdrawal of federal troops from the South in 1877, led to the collapse of Reconstruction and the establishment of the Jim Crow system of segregation and disenfranchisement that would last for nearly a century. One cannot say for certain how Lincoln would have handled these immense challenges, but it is clear that his assassination removed the one figure who might have been able to steer the nation towards a more just and lasting peace. The bullet fired by John Wilkes Booth did not just kill a president, it inflicted a deep and lasting wound on the nation's soul, a wound whose scars are still visible today. The legacy of that night at Ford's Theater also transformed the man, Abraham Lincoln, into a national myth. In life he was a complex and often controversial figure, a politician who faced harsh criticism and deep opposition. In death he became a martyr for the cause of union and freedom, the great emancipator, a secular saint in the American civil religion. His image, his words, and his story became powerful symbols, invoked by successive generations to define the meaning of the American experiment. Ford's Theater itself became a site of national pilgrimage and memory. It was closed by the government after the assassination, a place too haunted by tragedy to be used for entertainment. For years it was used as an office building and a warehouse, but it was eventually restored and reopened in 1968 as a working theater and a National Historic Site, a living memorial to the events of that terrible night. The Peterson House across the street remains as it was, the small, humble room where the great man died, preserved for posterity. The events of April 14, 1865, serve as a permanent, chilling reminder of the fragility of democracy and the devastating consequences of political violence. It shows how the actions of a few fanatical individuals, driven by hatred and a distorted sense of purpose, can alter the course of history. The story is not just one of a great man's death, but of a nation's loss, a loss of a leader, a loss of innocence, and the loss of a precious opportunity for a more peaceful and equitable reconciliation. The shot that rang out in the theater that night did not, as Booth had hoped, avenge the South or throw the Republic into chaos. Instead, it silenced a voice of moderation and mercy at the very moment it was needed most, and its echo has reverberated through all the long, difficult years of American history that have followed.